appreciate that. At this moment in time, the committee will pivot, which is what we do, right? We pivot, and we're going to go to the two bills that are before us. The first, and again, I would ask committee members, if you're joining us remotely and have a question, just wave your hand and we'll recognize you. We have a number of people who've signed up. This is House Bill 5054 from Chairman Solomon relating to net neutrality. And I see Chairman Solomon is ready to join us. Chairman, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. This bill, the Rhode Island Net Neutrality Act, would establish criteria for all state contractors and subcontractors to only purchase internet service from internet service providers that operate under the principles of net neutrality. Now, you may ask, what is net neutrality? Net neutrality is the principle that internet service providers must treat all internet communications equally and not discriminate user, content, website, platform, application, type of equipment, source address, destination address, or method of communication. With net neutrality, internet service providers may not intentionally block or slow down or charge money for specific online content. By limiting the scope of this legislation to just state contractors, as opposed to all internet service consumers in the state, this legislation avoids the issue of federal preemption. The goal of this legislation is to encourage internet service providers to abide by the principles of net neutrality for all customers in Rhode Island, as they will be obligated to for state contractors, and to create a separate environment for internet service customers not included in the scope of this law would be cost ineffective and a poor business practice option. Now, net neutrality is such an important concept that we really need to get on in the beginning. We've all been very fortunate to, be able to use the internet equally at this point, but as terms and service terms and contracts becoming more extensive, and as the principles of net neutrality, we're losing the battle on it. So this bill would lead us in the right direction of where we need to go. For example, it's so important that we get a head start on this, because as these terms and services, if you have an iPhone or an Apple product or any, if you subscribe to any product, there's pages and pages of terms of services that we don't even read. So by pushing for net neutrality, it really makes it an equal playing field for everyone, that we can all enjoy the use of the internet. And I think this is a great step in the right direction. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair Solomon. Any questions for the sponsor of the bill from committee members? Seeing none? Oh, I'm sorry. Representative Morales.
Hello, Chairman Solomon. Thank you again for introducing such an important bill like this. I just had a general question. Alongside Cox and Verizon, what other internet service providers would have to mandate and be a part of under this net neutrality law? Like, who else would this affect beyond just Cox and Verizon?
Well, I can't speak as to which service providers, but I can say that anyone that the state would contract with for services would have to abide by this. So it would be a part of whoever the state contracts with. So if the state's contracting with Cox Communications or Verizon, then they would be included. If there were to be a new company that would come in to the play in Rhode Island, such as a Comcast, then they would be included on this.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. At this point, we have 5 people who would like to testify. 4 are against, 1 is in support. Could we please dial up Russell Hanser to join us in the House Committee on Innovation, Internet, and Technology? Russell, are you there?
I am.
Good morning. Thank you, Mr. Hanser. You are on the floor to talk about H5054 Net Neutrality. And could you please turn your television off?
Okay, it is off. Should I begin?
Yes, please. The floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Good evening, members of the committee. My name is Russ Hanser. I'm a partner at Wilkinson, Barker & Nauer, where I practice communications and technology law. I appreciate the opportunity to testify today on behalf of Cox Communications. So, as a starting point, everyone agrees that it's important to protect internet openness, but the bill before you today is neither legally permissible nor an effective way to achieve this goal. I provided detailed written testimony, but here I'll just touch on my 4 main points. First, H5054 is unnecessary. Cox and other ISPs have made legally enforceable public commitments not to block, throttle, or discriminate against any lawful internet content or device. These commitments are enforceable today, both by the Federal Trade Commission and by the Rhode Island Attorney General. ISPs also remain subject to the FCC's transparency rule, which currently requires them to provide detailed, I should say currently and for a long time now, requires them to provide detailed information to consumers regarding their services and network practices. If they don't do that, or if they fail to abide by their disclosures, they are again subject to enforcement action by the FTC or by state authorities. And even apart from such enforcement, blocking, throttling, or discriminating against lawful traffic would harm broadband providers themselves because they can only succeed by winning and maintaining customers' trust and long-term business. Second point is that the FCC's 2015 framework, which this bill seeks to emulate, actually harmed consumers. The biggest distinction between what ISPs have committed to and what the FCC did in 2015 is that in addition to rules banning, blocking, throttling, and paid prioritization, the FCC imposed a vague set of common carrier requirements, including what's known as the General Conduct Rule. Under that rule, the FCC at any time could have found that any ISP practice was unlawful, even years after that practice had been initiated. H5054 would reimpose that open-ended requirement, and this would be a problem because we now know that the uncertainty resulting from the FCC's approach resulted in actual substantial reductions in broadband investment while that order was in effect. Between 2015 and 2017, new wireline broadband deployments declined by 55%, and wireless broadband deployments declined by 83% compared to the 2 previous years. Rhode Island should be working to narrow the digital divide, and it should not repeat the mistakes the FCC made in 2015. Third, the bill is preempted by federal law. Under Democrats and Republicans alike, the FCC has repeatedly found that the internet is quintessentially interstate in nature, and that federal law prohibits state and local net neutrality rules. The FCC's 2015 order, adopted under President Obama's second FCC chairman, prohibited states from adopting requirements that departed from or supplemented federal law in this area, and the FCC's more recent order reached the same conclusion. In its decision generally upholding that order, the FCC's RIF order, Restoring Internet Freedom Order, the D.C. Circuit found that the FCC could not preempt state laws on a blanket basis in all cases, but it reaffirmed that state laws are preempted when they conflict with or undermine federal policy. H5054, which seeks to revive precisely the same regime that the Restoring Internet Freedom Order repudiated, is clearly in conflict with federal policy and is therefore preempted. Further, this bill is not saved by the fact that it prohibits the state from purchasing broadband services from non-compliant ISPs rather than imposing net neutrality regulation outright. It does not save it from the preemption problem. The Supreme Court has held that states cannot regulate indirectly what they are preempted from regulating directly. It also has held that when a contracting limitation imposes requirements that apply to all of a provider's contracts, rather than only those contracts with the state, it is acting not only as a purchaser, but as a regulator. In those circumstances, contracting requirements that undermine federal policy, like those in this bill, are preempted. Fourth, and finally, federal legislation here is the best path forward. Cox supports the FCC's current approach, the Restoring Internet Freedom approach, but we have seen a ping-pong cycle in which the framework for broadband regulation changes every time the White House and the FCC change hands. That cycle seems likely to continue with the new administration now. The internet is too valuable to consumers and businesses to be subject to the shifting political winds that come with each change in control of the White House. For this reason, Cox and other ISPs have all expressed bipartisan support for federal legislation, have all expressed support for bipartisan federal legislation that will permanently preserve and solidify net neutrality protections while providing regulatory certainty and preserving investment incentives and the flexibility to innovate. We urge you to join Cox and other ISPs in calling for balanced federal legislation of this sort. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it, and I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Hanser. Any questions from the committee? Yes, Representative Place.
Sir, I got a question for you. Do you think that your company would change its policies on how it handles internet traffic just to bid on a state of Rhode Island contract?
So it's a great question. I'll emphasize I'm a private practice lawyer who represents Cox, but I am not at Cox, and I'm certainly not privy to Cox business decisions. So I might have to leave that to Cox itself. I will say that ISPs operate on regional basis and sometimes on a national basis, especially the wireless providers, but ISPs have to consider a single product that is generally offered across a wide variety of states, which is one of the issues that makes it very difficult to comply with state-specific requirements that may differ from one another. And that's one of the reasons why a federal framework is broadly viewed as being preferable to a state-by-state framework.
Yeah, when I look at this, I see it similar to when you look at some states like California can implement regulations like this because they're so large and they have such an impact on the market. But when a small state like Rhode Island, especially when it's just the state services, we try to do something like this, it becomes ineffective because, quite frankly, they just don't bother with the business because it's not cost effective for them.
Right. Again, not speaking to any specific business plans, I'm not privy to, but I think the point you're making is right, that any business is going to have to consider what is the cost of doing business with this particular customer, in this case the state, versus what are the benefits I'm going to get out of making those changes, and these changes could be substantial or at least could put the company at a lot of risk.
Thank you, Mr. Hanser. Great question, Rep. Appreciate that. Next, testifying, we have Danielle Lyons, who is also against. If we could please call Danielle. Mr. Lyons, are you there?
Yes.
Great. Welcome to the committee. You have the floor.
Thank you for allowing me to testify today. My name is Daniel Lyons. I'm a professor at Boston College Law School, where I teach and write in the fields of telecommunications, internet law, and federalism. I'm also a visiting scholar at the American Enterprise Institute, although I'm testifying today on behalf only of myself. I wish to make 2 points about House Bill 5054. First, it's unlikely that Rhode Island has the authority to enact net neutrality, as the bill conflicts with the Federal Communications Commission's carefully balanced regulatory approach, and is probably preempted under the Supremacy Clause. Second, even if Rhode Island could enact this bill, there are good reasons why it should not do so. On preemption, the FCC's Restoring Internet Freedom Order repealed federal regulations similar to those that the bill would impose on broadband providers. When the D.C. Circuit upheld that order in the Mozilla case, the court noted that if the commission can explain how a state practice actually undermines the 2018 order, then it can invoke conflict preemption. In a case called Geyer, the Supreme Court clarified that when a federal agency faces a choice of legal regimes and deliberately imposes a this far and no further regime, then it preempts state laws that would go further. And that's precisely the situation we have here. This bill would impose obligations that the FCC expressly rejected as harmful to consumers and innovation. So I think preemption is likely. Nor I think can Rhode Island avoid preemption by substituting the power of the purse instead of regulation. The state has every right to request that broadband providers include net neutrality obligations in its own contract. This is called the market participant doctrine. But that doctrine generally does not extend to the use of the state's purchasing power to affect contracts between the provider and third parties. Now, admittedly, the new administration is likely to go in a different direction on net neutrality, but I'd encourage the committee to wait and see what the Biden FCC will do before acting. At best, this bill could be superfluous. At worst, it could conflict with the Commission's future plans. And if you could adopt net neutrality rules, I think there's good reasons why you might not want to do so. The primary concern with net neutrality has always been paid prioritization, the favoring of some traffic over others. But there are good and bad reasons why you might want to prioritize traffic. For example, in the event of network congestion, you might want to prioritize a telemedicine application over a cat video or a web page, especially if the web browser consumer won't even notice that he's been deprioritized. Net neutrality rules deny us that flexibility for smart traffic management because of the risk of abuse. It's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, and before you do that, you should understand clearly the downside of prohibiting companies from engaging in so-called good prioritization. Note also the risk that this bill poses to taxpayers. There are few options for purchasing broadband service. If a broadband provider cannot or will not offer service to consumers on a net neutral basis, the bill excludes that provider from competing for government contracts, which could increase the price that state agencies pay for their internet connectivity. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Lyons. Good point about a Biden FCC. And you win extra points from being from my alma mater, Boston College. So thank you for joining us.
Hey, my pleasure.
Okay, have a good evening. Next,
Take care.
Ciao. We have Timothy Wilkinson, who is joining us, and he is also against. Mr. Wilkinson, are you joining us?
I am.
And the floor is yours, sir.
Yes. Thank you. Good evening, Madam Chair and esteemed members of the committee. My name is Tim Wilkerson, and I am president of the New England Cable and Telecommunications Association, or NECTA. In Rhode Island, NECTA represents Cox Communications. A recent economic impacts study conducted by Dr. Tabaldi of Bryant University concluded that Cox produces nearly $700 million annually in economic output and labor income for the state and employs approximately 800 Rhode Island residents. In the 4 years since state policymakers attempted to mandate ISP compliance with net neutrality principles through the passage of laws or executive orders, no cable broadband provider has violated these important consumer-focused principles. In Rhode Island, similar efforts have been attempted in the past by advocates warning of the potential threats to the consumer experience. Despite these warnings, no NECTA member or other ISP has broken any existing state or federal law by violating net neutrality tenets and upending the user experience. It is quite the opposite. During the past 4 years and for decades before, our members have invested billions of dollars into their broadband networks to ensure they exceed ever-expanding consumer demand, not diminishing consumer experience. Data collected during the pandemic demonstrates that our networks are available to all consumers without interruption. Our network strength had the capacity to meet the pandemic-driven demand for more Zoom meetings, distant learning, telemedicine, and binge watching. Those robust networks are the byproduct of continuous and intensive capital investments and upgrades. Providing world-class internet speed is the hallmark of our companies, not diminishing their experience through arbitrary or intentional violations of net neutrality principles. To reiterate, NECTA members do not block, throttle, or otherwise interfere with the lawful online activity of our members and have consistently affirmed these commitments since the FCC's first articulation of the Open Internet Principles in 2005. It is important to underscore that these commitments are more than a pledge. They are part of our company's operating DNA. If we conducted such illegal activities, the Rhode Island Attorney General and 3 federal agencies, FTC, FCC, and DOJ, have existing authority to investigate and bring civil penalties against our members or other ISPs. But you do not read such stories in the papers or online for one simple reason. That is not how we treat our customers' experience. A wide variety of ISPs support congressional action to enact bipartisan legislation at the national level that preserves the principles of no blocking, throttling, or unfair discrimination of lawful internet traffic. There should not be a patchwork of state laws to regulate an inherent interstate service such as the internet. This should be regulated by Congress and Congress alone. Without congressional action, net neutrality will continue to be a political football that diverts time and resources away from innovation and job creation. By permanently rejecting outdated 1930s-style Title II regulations and adopting a modern federal framework, Congress would achieve the right balance of government oversight of ISPs while fostering private investment and market competition. Historically, Rhode Island has adopted a modern, light-touch regulatory regime over the communications marketplace that spurred industry competition, leading to a convergence of residential and business consumer video, broadband, voice, and wireless offerings from new service providers at lower costs. As a result of this light-touch approach, the network quality and diversity of products offered by companies in Rhode Island is virtually unparalleled. Our members' network superiority is highlighted by Netflix ISP Speed Index, ranking Cox as tied for #1 for U.S. ISPs for primetime Netflix performance in the United States just last month. With that, I thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson. Any questions? Yes, Rep. Morales.
Thank you so much for coming on and testifying. We really do appreciate it. I got a question just based on one of the comments that you had made. How would enacting net neutrality prevent job creations and or innovation?
If there were a number of states which have already enacted net neutrality, if there will continue to be more states that did this and create a patchwork in which ISPs had to recognize geographic boundaries, which the internet does not do. When you hit enter, when you have a Google search, for instance, and that request goes through the internet's tubes, it does not recognize state boundaries. It does not even recognize sovereign boundaries for nations. That search here in Providence may go to Quebec. It may go to Mexico City. It may go to Seattle before it returns back to Rhode Island. Having our engineers and having the people who manage the network be able to be required to change the way that activity takes place would divert necessary resources and would unnecessarily, I would argue, lead to divert those resources and time and energy and focus from these companies from not expanding their natural business to be then spent on trying to recognize and change fundamentally how their business operations work. And that is something that, without evidence of us actually committing any actual violation of these, I think is a tall order and a risky approach for any state to take.
Thank you.
Okay.
You're welcome.
Any other questions from any of the other members? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Wilkinson, for your testimony. We will now go to Randall Rose. And again, I want to remind everyone, it's 3 minutes of testimony, and our second vice chair has the timer. Good evening, Mr. Rose. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Let me just turn off the audio here. Thank you. So I'm glad to be speaking in favor of the net neutrality bill, which of course simply enacts into law the exact text of Governor Raimondo's 2018 executive order. It does not change what's enforced. It simply converts it from an executive order to a law. And I noticed that the opponents of net neutrality have not legally challenged Governor Raimondo's executive order. So they will. So I don't think it is likely that they will be challenging this as a law. There have actually been stronger laws on net neutrality passed in several other states. For example, Washington State passed one in 2018, and so far that has, so Washington State passed a law that not only applies to state contractors, but requires all customers in the state to benefit from net neutrality principles. And that Washington State law has not been struck down in court either. So it's not clear, of course, I can't give any guarantees on how courts can rule, but since more ambitious laws like Washington State's have not been struck down in court, and Governor Raimondo's order has not been challenged, I don't think this bill is likely to be struck down either. In any case, as several of the other witnesses said, there is a good chance that the Biden administration will reverse the Trump administration's extraordinarily unpopular decision to terminate net neutrality. When the Trump administration decided to terminate net neutrality rules in 2017, there was a poll by the University of Maryland which presented respondents with detailed arguments on both sides of the net neutrality issue. And after hearing those arguments on both sides, a huge majority of respondents, including even 75% of Republicans, preferred to have net neutrality regulations. So it is an extraordinarily popular move, and it is likely that the Biden administration will reverse the Trump administration's decision at the federal level. But it is still important to show support for net neutrality. I think a lot of people will be grateful if Rhode Island passes a law for net neutrality, because it really does help Rhode Island consumers and businesses. The witness from Cox said that Cox had promised not to block or throttle traffic, but he did not mention any promise about paid prioritization. And paid prioritization is a very important part of net neutrality principles that this bill covers. What this bill says is that internet service providers who contract with the state are not allowed to shake down Rhode Island businesses by going to the business and saying, unless you pay us extra, we will not speed up your customer's internet connection to your site. So what they can do is, unfortunately, current law does allow, without Governor Raimondo's executive order, current law would allow the internet service providers to go to a couple of Rhode Island businesses and say, okay, if business A pays us more, we will let business A's website load faster. If business B does not pay us extra, we will not let business B's website load faster. That's paid prioritization. It amounts to an out-of-state monopoly or near monopoly, shaking down Rhode Island businesses, and that kind of thing is the reason why the vast majority of people want net neutrality, so we don't get these kind of shakedowns from out-of-state companies like Cox and Verizon.
Thank you, Mr. Rose. Thank you for that point. We appreciate that. Paid prioritization is certainly very valid. Are there any questions for this witness? Seeing none? Okay. Thank you, Mr. Rose. We appreciate your testimony tonight. And now is Hannah Stern with us. Hannah Stern is with the ACLU, and she is in support of 5054. Hannah, are you there?
I am. Hello.
Hello,
Can you hear me?
Ms. Stern. Yes, thank you for joining us. You have the floor.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee, for your time this evening. And thank you to Chairman Solomon also for his advocacy for this important legislation. My name is Hannah Stern. I'm testifying on behalf of the ACLU of Rhode Island, and we are very much in support of this piece of legislation. What this bill would really codify into state law is the state executive order, which already requires that internet service contractors abide by net neutrality principles. And this has been briefly summarized previously, but what this essentially means is that internet service providers must provide non-discriminatory access to the internet for everyone and not pick and choose what information someone receives or how long it takes to receive that information. This is precisely the same principle that phone companies are and have been bound to. So we really consider net neutrality to be one of the most important modern free speech issues because it guarantees the open and equitable access to a medium which all of us cannot go a day without, especially in this time where we're dependent on the internet. Like you mentioned at the beginning, Chairwoman, we need the internet for work, we need the internet for school, we need the internet for staying in contact with family, and so much more, especially now. I think that it's like the last year has really just driven home the importance of this. So ultimately, we hope that, especially during this time where the importance of the internet and the importance of net neutrality principles has only become more clear, that this bill will be favorably acted upon. Thank you very much for your time. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Stern. Any questions from the committee? Seeing none, thank you very much for joining us tonight. Hannah Stern from the ACLU. We appreciate your testimony. That concludes the verbal portion of our testimony. We have written testimony. Diane Myers of Portsmouth is for. Dan Lyons against. Russell Hanser against. Gerald Keegan against. And Edward Garcia, Rhode Island Library Association, is for. Stephen Dahl is against. Michael Noah is for. Claire Stedmuller, I hope I didn't say that correctly, but sorry, is for. And Jean Williams from Wakefield is also for. That concludes the hearing on House Bill 5054. Okay?